Serendipity is one hell of a thing, guys. I started writing this script around Christmas of 2019, having found out that Fantagraphics was finally doing an English translation of Paramus, a bit of a comic book white whale for me. Years of on and off searching for a translation had led to my discovery of a slew of Argentine comic books, with El Eternaut, or the Eternaut, chief amongst them. There was a plan to record this whole thing before the April release of Paramus from Fantagraphics, tie it all in. It was gonna be great, boy, let me tell ya. But then life kinda happened. I don't know if you guys watch the news at all, but
China has identified the cause of the mysterious pneumonia outbreak in Wuhan City.
Now to growing concerns about the deadly coronavirus officially hitting the U.S.
My fellow Americans,
this is the most drastic action we can take. Only essential businesses can have workers commuting to the job or on the job. Second rule, remain indoors to the greatest extent to protect physical and mental health. Hello?
Let's just say in the past few weeks, months, a story involving a ragtag group of average citizens forced to barricade themselves inside as a global catastrophe quietly but suddenly unfolds before their very eyes, with every foray into the outside world a strict trial in maintaining sterility while simultaneously evaluating the risk and reward of what was once an everyday occurrence, has gained relevance. It's great though, you should read it. I guess I'm gonna try and convince you to do that by talking about it, in an attempt to avoid detailed summary because I do want people to actually read this. A brief overview is necessary. Published from 1957 to 1959 by Hector Germán Osterheld and Francisco Solano Lopez, The Eternaut tells the story of a mysterious time traveler recalling the manner in which he came to find himself in these unusual circumstances. His tale begins on Earth, with an eerie snow falling across the globe, killing anyone that comes into contact with it. The outdoors is transformed into an apocalyptic wasteland near instantaneously. As events unfold, our hero and his surviving friends discover that the snow is only the opening salvo of a dire attack on humanity by otherworldly entities. Again, this is only the first act of the story, but it's these opening chapters that I tend to remember the most. They have a startlingly unique tone and set up the visual language for the rest of the series, and contain some of the most enduring images found in the comic. More on that later. As a reader, you can almost feel the silence, the way the world quiets down during a snowfall as every noise gets absorbed and dampened, trapped in an oppressive atmosphere. While Osterheld could have used a litany of explosions to alert our heroes to the danger, it's the absence of city noise that draws their attention to the impending crisis. This tone is mirrored in the reactions of our protagonists, the strangeness of these events eliciting a quiet, melancholic curiosity. Osterheld and Lopez set their story in their home of Buenos Aires. The mere fact that it begins to snow would be a foreign occurrence, let alone with such intensity. With this choice for an initial threat, Osterheld seamlessly combines the classic pulp of Robinson Crusoe, then contemporary fears regarding nuclear fallout, and the science fiction charm of A Terror Beyond the Stars. Noted publisher and critic Lawrence Person wrote of the sci-fi genre that the best conveyed huge cognitive loads about the future by depicting, in best show-don't-tell fashion, the interaction of its characters with the quotidian minutiae of their environment. Eternaut embodies this in the most primal fashion. For the entire first act, the environment is the antagonist, and understanding it in detail is what allows our protagonist to succeed. By taking a tangible, earthbound place with all the trappings of a lived-in city, and transforming it into something wildly other, it simultaneously gives a reader grounding and a strong sense of disassociation, turning a world similar into what we know into something fundamentally wrong. This method of taking a familiar locale and transforming it into an otherworldly nightmare is mirrored by quite a few more contemporary staples of the genre. If you've ever played Silent Hill, seen Annihilation, or read Roadside Picnic, you'll get what I'm talking about here. While the protagonists of Eternaut may have been offered a brief physical reprieve, cloistered behind household walls keeping them safe from the deadly miasma, there's nothing comfortable about their mental state. And the paneling here does wonders to heighten this. Lopez excels at picking his frames, using anonymous wide shots to emphasize the sprawl of the danger, forcing us to address how trapped our heroes are, and then isolating the characters from one another with tense, claustrophobic close-ups, ramping up the paranoia and dread. Alternating between these two extremes does wonders to place readers in the tense survivalist mentality of our happenstance group. Tension rapidly builds as the survivors are forced to prioritize and address their problems. In the attempts to deal with these issues, we see the theme that Osterheld will return to throughout the story, that of solidarity as opposed to superheroes. Osterheld's intent was to create a story of the everyman going beyond a simple ensemble cast. He stated, quote, The true hero of the Eternaut is a collective hero, a piece of humanity. It therefore reflects, without my intending it to, one of my deepest convictions. The only real hero is the hero en masse. Never the individual hero, the solitary hero. And this is evident from the very outset of the story. The Eternaut initially appears to an unnamed scribe asking him to aid in his quest. Despite his uncanny nature, having become an individual transported outside of time, even he needs help. This theme acts as a driving force throughout the rest of the narrative. As events progress, each member of Juan Salvo's group exhibits qualities that strengthen the collective. Merit is based not just on how skilled an individual is at a task, but whether or not those skills are used to benefit the welfare of others. The lone wolves and solitary survivors electing not to create solutions, as Salvo's group does, but would rather scavenge and hunt down those that do, are painted with an unflattering brush. As the story unfolds, we see fewer and fewer of these bandits as they fall to infighting or the more overwhelming alien threat. The implicit idea seems to be that the only way to persist in surviving is through ingenuity, pooling resources, and collective action. It's worth noting that these values extended beyond the page for Osterheld. He was at the center of an Argentine publishing boom during this era, publishing comics via magazines such as Frontera and Hora Cero. Coupled with this was a growing Argentine sci-fi fan base, thanks to the likes of magazines such as Masaya, which cultivated a readership of model makers, gadgeteers, and the like. These individuals, the hobbyist, the basement tinkerer, the part-time science enthusiast, they were Osterheld's audience as well as his cast, and to an extent it represented Osterheld himself. Sadly, it was this insistence on mixing the personal and political with popular fiction that led to the end of the Eternaut. While working on a revised, more overtly political rendition of his story in the 70s, Osterheld disappeared. Blackbagged by the ruling Argentine dictatorship due to his open criticism of the junta, his association with leftist political group Montoneros, and for his work. All of this, the combined politics, message, and iconography of Osterheld and his story, has led to the Eternaut persisting as a symbol of dissidence in Argentina. While the obvious comparison would be to that of V from V for Vendetta, I would argue Eternaut's appearances are a bit more nuanced, and maybe even a bit more helpful. Juan Salvo has none of the ownership baggage V does, raising far fewer questions regarding the ethics of forking over money to a major corporation for the sake of protesting the very thing that corporation may be lobbying for. And while V for Vendetta deals with similar subject matter, wrestling with the same question of making a hero out of the everyman, it's notable that V, and Evie by the end of her arc, are quite far from being so. Having been experimented on, inadvertently enhanced, and given years of monastic focus with which to enact his plan, there's a bit of the old supernatural exceptionalism at the heart of Alan Moore's creation. Juan Salvo, on the other hand, is perhaps a truer representation of the common man, a character made up of self-doubt and second-guessing, often deferring to an expert, or simply whoever might have a better idea for a given situation. This may be why his image is so recurrent in Argentine street art. It could truly be anyone under that mask. This plasticity is evident in Eternaut's graffiti appearances, with the face behind the mask being swapped out for former President Nestor Kirchner in recent years. This is the beauty of Osterheld's metaphor writ large. His story of an entity that persists through time, set adrift through eons of eternity, yet finding purpose and continuing with his struggle is the story of the Eternaut itself. That this tale has managed to not only endure against the passage of time, but grow to the status of national icon, to international renown, it's staggering. In some ways, perhaps it's an indictment. The lessons he sought to impart still something we struggle with, the wars we're fighting now the same ones we've been fighting since his birth. I think that's a reasonable interpretation. I don't necessarily like to look at it that way, I think it's bleak as hell, but I think it's an interpretation. Personally, I'd prefer to look at it as a rumination on how the truly great stories, whether they be small like a family trying to weather a storm, or large like on the scale of an interstellar conflict, persist forever, along with the authors that write them. After all, the whole point is it can be anyone under the mask, right?